IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, this is Megha Pardhi. I'm research analyst on China Studies at the Takshashila Institution. In today's episode of All Things Policy, we are discussing changing nature of warfare in 21st century with emerging technologies. Technology and warfare have always been interconnected. And to quote from Alex Rowland's book, War and Technology, from Stone Age to nuclear age, technology has driven evolution of warfare. Now, while advancement in technology has given rise to new ways to wage a war, on the other hand, wars have also pushed innovation and development in technology. For example, World War II was responsible to accelerate progress in radar technology, medicine and surgery, and even sow the seeds of technologies that resulted in the development of computers as we use today. So, as technology evolves, warfare evolves with it, and vice versa. To further discuss this interconnection of technology and warfare, we have with us today Lieutenant General Prakash Menon. General Menon is Director of Strategic Studies Program at Takshashila Institution and a former military advisor to National Security Council Secretariat. He has written extensively on various topics related to military, and he's author of book The Strategy Trap: India and Pakistan Under Nuclear Shadow. Welcome, General Menon.
Thank you, Megha.
So, General Menon, how is warfare changing in 21st century? What changes are we observing in traditional domains of warfare like land, air, and sea? And what do you think are drivers of these changes?
So, I think before we actually look at warfare, let us be clear about the two terminologies which we tend to use. One is war, and the other is warfare. So, what we are now discussing is warfare. And war actually describes a state of relationships between two parties which are in conflict. And its very nature is the use or threatened use of organized violence for political purposes. That is the nature of wars. And that does not change. What changes is warfare, which is the character of war itself. How is force threatened or applied? So let us be very clear that we are talking about the aspect of warfare where force is threatened or applied. And as you said, it constantly changes. And one of the main drivers, no doubt, is technology, which is not the only driver. There's also human agency, because you can have technology, but for what purposes that you utilize it matters, and the human being drives it. And of course, the other one is the domain in which this is played out, which is air, land, sea, space, and cyber in today's world. So the process is constantly changing because driven, as you said, by technology and human agency and its application in various geographies. But what we see now at the beginning of the 22nd century is the fact that we are witnessing a larger global power struggle in which is triggered an arms race, and obviously technologies in other domains or whatever domain which is developed is now being more and more pulled into for use for military purposes. And therefore, this purpose of war does not change. How force is applied is constantly under change. That is the change which we are witnessing. And in that, it is about identifying a target and neutralizing it. At the essence of what warfare is. Neutralization can have many meanings. You can destroy, you can injure, you can simply blind, you can make it deaf. And therefore, neutralization would be to neutralize the ability or ability for carrying out of functions in the arena of warfare. So, if you look at the phenomenon, the trajectory of all this, you will find that more and more these sort of things are being done stealthily. They're being done from much greater distances than before. And third, it can actually be targeted very accurately. So if you look at these three as the phenomenons in which the advance of trajectory is taking place, warfare is now actually gaining pace in these three: more accurate, more stealth, more distance. And I think that is what we are witnessing. Obviously, it is also driven by the geopolitical struggle at the global level.
Thank you so much. So there's been talk of new domains like cyber warfare and information warfare. What do you think? Can you explain a bit about information warfare for our listeners?
Let's look at the role of information in terms of warfare. And I think we need to understand that finally, all that you did in warfare was about trying to impact the decision making of your adversary. And that was how do you affect him psychologically? You can destroy and kill him, which means it's the easiest thing to do. But to also use or threaten force by which he has to accept defeat or at least come and talk or come to the table and start negotiating, the acceptance of that had to be psychological. So, whatever you did in warfare had to have that psychological effect, which means it was already about influencing his information system, which is the decision making system. But today, this is the effect which you want to achieve. But the means of doing that has now the span and the spectrum has increased, right from the fact that you need, as I said, you need to be accurate, which means you have to have knowledge of that person. You have to have intelligence of this. Today, the ability to actually penetrate the systems of the other, find out what they are doing, what they are planning is much more than ever before, because at the root of this is the digital age and where cyber and information warfare. Cyber is the domain, information warfare is the type what we are going to do with information. So, with information, you can actually have knowledge. With that knowledge, you can apply it for many things. You can neutralize his equipment when you want, you can change his mind, you can plant false stories, you can have fake news, you can get him to actually believe things because of the fact that you control the domain of information. And digital warfare, digital space makes that now very easy to undertake. And that is what the major change is, that the ability to influence the mind of decision makers and of the populace through various means has increased. And that is going to, it's only gathering pace. But I think one point I must make here that in warfare, it is not a unilateral action. Whatever you do is contested by your adversary, who can be as wily as you are. You can evade, you can fool you. So, this is the contest which will take place. So, it doesn't have a free run, but the fact that you can influence the minds of the adversary and large populace makes all the difference. So, information warfare is today gaining strength as part of the other means of warfare. On its own, it cannot possibly survive in the sense that you can't change the minds of people, but some action has to follow after that. Or something has to take place. So, it is not a standalone, it is now part of the larger orchestra of warfare itself. It is an instrument which is always there. It is getting sharpened primarily because of technology.
This is very interesting because information, when we talk about information warfare, they think this is something new, but this has actually been there. Just the mode and method of it has changed. So there was one time when nuclear bomb and hydrogen bomb dominated the course of security studies. They were touted as a war stoppers technologies. Today there is a talk of AI and big data and cloud computing, and they're slowly dominating discourse around military and technology. Do you think, or will there ever be a single, war stopper kind of tech? Or do you think this new technologies have that potential?
No, I think they are different, at least in the present state of the technology which we can foresee. And let me tell you why. The nuclear revolution was about the fact that the sheer destructive power of the nuclear weapon and the inability to defend against it. Despite even today, ballistic missile defenses coming up, they can always actually overwhelm them. They can always be bypassed. And even if one nuclear or two nuclear bombs get and hit, it's a major city, it is an unthinkable disaster. So the nuclear revolution imposed certain, let's say, cost to its use simply because one could not fully be certain about defending against it. And that is what made it the revolution, that you could not fight the big wars because it might go to the nuclear level. And even if a couple of nuclear weapons were fired, it would have been disastrous for everybody. And nobody knows what will happen when the first nuclear bomb is set off between nuclear powers, how that war is going to actually escalate. So the nuclear revolution could not be contested and therefore remains very much a big war stopper. But when you come to AI, quantum computing, the new technologies, big data, cloud computing, and so on, which you mentioned, it's a different thing. It does not belong to that category at all because all of these are the means which can help you to penetrate systems, get you the knowledge, how you can interfere with people, interfere with their information system itself, and how you can actually change belief systems and so on. But these are easier said than done on a large scale because human beings can be manipulated. But remember, they always have a way of finding out the truth. So while they may believe certain lies for some time, but may not be able to keep them. And therefore, one advantage which countries which are authoritarian have is about being able to use this in in an effective manner within the country itself, because it can control the information, not democracies. So within the countries, authoritarians have an advantage. Between countries, the ability to actually counter it through means which you have, therefore, does not make it the type of revolution and does not keep the fight which we are talking about away. The wars will continue. It only changes its forms, and the purposes would always be political. But the change in forms, because of technology, is speeding up, will continue to do so. But in essence, it will be about getting the other party to do something which they don't want to do, which is against their will.
Okay, so even if there is a huge advancement in AI and big data, human agency will always be an important part of warfare. Yeah, on this note, folks, we'll take a short break. Please stay tuned.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, good friend of the show, good friend of Cyrus and myself, Mangalam Mallu is on. He's the assistant editor and anchor at CNBC TV 18, and he and Cyrus discuss how the budget of 2022 affects us all. On This Round is on Me, we flipped the script as Gauri is a guest on her own show. Check it out as Kavita Rajwade, my co-founder at IVM Podcast, hosts this very special episode. On Misconduct, Ragvi and Nisha are joined by Priya Mirza. She's the host of the Longest Constitution podcast. They take a close look at the former Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi. On Audio Gyan, Kedar talks to Dr. Sumin Patel. She's the co-founder of the Bombay Wala Historical Works. She talks about how she picks out the most interesting stories to showcase. And on Tere Mere Raste, Keshav tells us the amazing transformation of the ravaged land of Purnapani. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, please do tell a friend. It really does help us when you spread the word about our podcast. And I'd also like to ask you if you could rate or recommend wherever you listen to our podcast. And speaking of where you listen to the show, if you're on an Android phone, do check out our new Android app. We have a brand new app with a brand new listening experience. Definitely check it out. I think you will enjoy it. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. We are discussing evolving nature of warfare with emerging technologies, and we have General Menon with us today. So I'll zoom out a little bit and go towards Clausewitz's notion of warfare. So he gave centrality to violence in war. Do you think the changing nature of war in modern times and new form of wars like cyber warfare and information warfare are drifting away from the violence-centric notion of war? I mean, do you think war will remain violent in future?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The question is, how do we define violence? And when in Clausewitz's time, obviously, it had in its very expression the idea of physical force, which was defined as violence. Therefore, if we expand that, and physical force, when it was used and still used, is finally about how does it affect psychologically the decision makers, the populists on the other side. They have to accept defeat, which is a mental state. I can be wounded and I can fight on because I do not accept defeat. So, violence, as we have understood, probably we need to now define this in a manner that anything which can cause pain, not only physically, but psychologically, would also have to be categorized as violence when we have this notion of no violence is actually used or exchanged in physical form, but the effect of what you are doing, the interaction, does violence to your mind, makes you fear, makes you change your mind, makes you affect defeat. That I think is possible. But in the end, if you are talking about territorial control and territorial aggression, you might be able to go and conquer territory and people might just about give it up and you will allow you to do so. Let's say Russia goes into Ukraine, it's a large landmass, takes over Ukraine. What happens after that? Russia will have to still have its soldiers guarding places physically, be in control of the ground. You need a soldier with a gun in his hand to control ground. So, whereas if you want to talk about the context is territorial aggression, then I'm afraid that the idea that you can do away with the notion of violence and just get the other person to change his mind may not work. But if you are trying to get another person to change their mind on an issue which you are in conflict with, something which you don't agree or you want to make him agree against your will, then that has always been there. And that is why the notion of economic wars, trade wars, capitalist wars, which is in the economic field, has always been there. It has been meant to coerce. There's always been also technology wars. You control your technology, you refuse technology to the others, you try and see as the other person doesn't get what you want. That has also been the case. And then geopolitical wars, which is about control of territory itself. And then, of course, is military wars, where the military forces are in confrontation where they use force. All these elements have always been part of the larger construct of war itself. And they play a different role depending upon the stage at which this confrontation is, because all this is part of a larger power struggle between nations. In that power struggle, all types of wars and warfares are fought by different means and in different geographies. That was the case before. What we are now witnessing is the growing, you can say, domination of technology because of the extensive use of digital technology. And more you depend upon more digital technology, remember that also becomes your greater vulnerability. And in wars and warfare, you always target the vulnerability of the other. And that is why we find that this is now a state where the idea that violence cannot be there, that violence need not be there, is only about changing minds. I mean, that has always been the case. I mean, after all, Russia is massing its troops on Ukraine. It's massed its troops. There's a threat. But if Ukraine accepts part of it or if NATO comes to an agreement part of it, Russia would have actually, without using violence, By the threat of violence itself, it would have done it. So if you think that people are going to change their mind because there is the threat of violence absent, it will all depends on the issues at stake. If the issue at stake does not warrant and that nation can actually live with that conceding to that point, they probably will accept without violence. But the issues are much important to it, then they will fight. And violence will therefore very much be part of that interaction.
Interesting. So, I mean, the way we define violence is probably going to change, or means what we consider as a violence will define what we consider warfare, probably. So, moving on to countries who are actually trying to experiment with this new domains. So, there's America, China, and as you already mentioned, Russia. They are trying to experiment with this new technologies and implement them in their military. China has goals to modernize their military by 2049 and build an intelligentized military which uses AI and big data in real time. And I think in one of the speeches in around 2020, maybe Prime Minister Modi had acknowledged the importance of advanced research in defense technologies, military technologies. But when we look at India, we don't have military strategy or advanced technology strategy as such. So where does India stand today? Are we ready for the changes brought about due to these technologies in warfare?
Well, to make a judgment where India stands today, I would have to know the details of what is going on within the corridors of South Bloc and so on, which I don't. But we should not be satisfied with the state which we are in because we are still the second or the third biggest arms importers in the world. That itself is a reflection about our dependency on defense technology from the foreign element, and which is what we are trying to rectify. But it'll never be perfect. But the fact is that we have made attempts, and this problem has remained intractable. Although in the recent times, Atma Nirbharta is a slogan which we have adopted. It's too early to say what progress India has made in that. At the moment, we are not perhaps in a good state, but whatever it is, we have been trying to make up by import. So, since this is state has to be redeemed and efforts are ongoing, to compare where we stand today, we must understand that China is certainly far ahead of us and we need to actually do a lot of things. But that means we must be able to first understand the type of wars that we are going to fight. And to do that, we need political guidance in the form of a national security doctrine or a strategy, which can allow for the planners in the defense arena to develop the type of instruments which they require to fight the type of wars. And this is actually, if you look at the budget which has come out today, we know that the country doesn't have enough money. So when we also plan to fight our wars, we must plan to fight and change our method of fighting, our doctrines and our tactics based on the fact that we cannot be having or be equipped with the most modern or the high end technologies which we wish to have. And that can be made up by human agency, by intelligence, by innovation, which is what we are trying to do. So I think this is an area of concern. We must not try to get the high end technology straight away, although we must have many efforts in that direction, because our threat is today. And therefore, developing all these is going to take time. We need, therefore, to adjust our tactics and our doctrines to make up for what we cannot possibly attain in such a short period of time. But I would think if India's innovative capacity is unleashed in the defense domain, that itself is a challenge. We can certainly come out with a lot of things in niche technologies or game changers, which might make a difference. Because in the end, warfare in its actual practice, victory lies not in technology, but in the ability of the human spirit to fight and win. That makes a difference. And I think on that count, India may not be lacking.
Thank you so much for your insightful comments. To our listeners, if you'd like to know more about this course in China about emerging technologies and their applications in PLA, please check out our newsletter, China Tech Dispatch. Link is in the description. And on this note, folks, we'll wrap up our discussion today. Thank you so much, Chandra Menon, for joining us.
Thank you, Megha.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Are you looking for finance products and services that can enhance your personal finance experience? Are you looking for a space to talk about your financial product or service? And are you looking for a crisp talk show where the conversation is all about money? Well, your search ends here. Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta and I'm host of the Paisa Paisa podcast, and I invite you for the conversation about your personal finance on each Monday on the IVM Podcast app or the website or on any podcast streaming platforms. See you folks.
What is the workplace and how does your gender and body affect your right at work? Hey, I'm Priya Mirza, and on the Longest Constitution podcast, we critically examine the vision of the Indian Constitution and laws. In season 1, we looked at sex, gender, sexuality in India, and the landmark judgments which transformed our rights as citizens in this country. In season 2, we discussed the laws which shape the workplace and examine how ability, competence, and merit impact us, and much more. Join me, Priya Mirza, every Wednesday only on the IVM Podcast app, website, and all the major podcast streaming platforms.